Good evening, comrades. Thanks for joining us for another session of Why Marx. We're continuing to look at the question of party and program. Tonight, we're focusing on the Bolsheviks and their program. Did it fail in 1917, as the story goes? So we've got with us Jack Conrad from the Communist Party of Great Britain, who's going to introduce this session for about 45 minutes, and then we're opening up for questions and comments from the floor, as always. Thanks for joining, Jack.
Comrades, it's a delight to join you, and I hope we have a fruitful discussion. I know a lot of comrades, are well genned up on this subject. The left, the modern left knows its Russian Revolution in the same way that Russian revolutionaries knew France and often spoke, with parallels and try to understand their own time using not just French terms, but French parallels. Either way, I am going to do a little bit of background, so forgive me if you already know it. I suppose we could begin with the First International. I'm not going to go into the terrible detail, but the point I would make is that Karl Marx actually represented Russia on the executive, on the General Council of the First International. Of course, this was with the approval of Russians, but it should be pointed out it was with the approval of the Narodniks, and it was the Narodniks that were responsible for translating quite a bit of Karl Marx, not least Capital. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, a Russian edition of Capital actually came out before there was the English Samuel Moore translation. But the point I'm really wanting to make here is that when the first Russian Marxists emerged, this is Plekhanov and his group, it has to be said that Marx was extremely skeptical. Basically, he looked forward to the overthrow of the Tsar as the main thing, and he didn't think that the peasants would act in any decisive way. And if you ask, well, what about the workers? He would have replied to you, well, what workers? Now, towards the end of his life, and certainly towards the end of Engels's life, that started to change. Russia, was industrializing, mainly through the state. There was a working class movement. Nonetheless, Russia clearly wasn't what you would call an ordinary European country. It was extremely backward. It not only had the Tsar, it was dominated by agriculture, peasant agriculture, not capitalist agriculture. Anyway, the long and the short of it is that what we have is not only the emergence of a Marxist group, albeit exiled in Switzerland. What we have is not only the movement of intellectuals going over to Marxism, we actually see the first signs of independent working class activity in the 1890s. Hence, we get the formation, it was abortive, the formation of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. They sent one of their people, Peter Struve, who ended up as a supporter of the whites, to write a manifesto, not a program, but a manifesto. But I don't know how many of the Central Committee were arrested almost straight away, but I think about half of them were arrested. And really, the real foundation Congress of the RSDLP took place in Brussels and then London. And of course, that was under the leadership of Iskra, the paper that was the sort of brainchild of Lenin, but also in cooperation with the old guys in Switzerland, Plekhanov, Axelrod, and others. And it was their program that had been drawn up, okay, with heated exchanges between Martov on the one side and Lenin on the one side and Plekhanov. They'd drawn up a program, and they took that program. You should read Lenin on it. Didn't like it very much, and Plekhanov didn't like being criticized either for these two upstarts pointing out the inadequacies. Either way, it was that program that the RSDLP Congress debated. There were a couple of amendments not to the liking of the leadership of Iskra, Plekhanov, and Lenin. Nonetheless, that's what is agreed. Now, that program is the program of Bolshevism, but it's also the program of Menshevism. And this program lasted. Okay, there were various moves, for example, in 1917 to amend it by the Bolsheviks. This program lasted until 1919. And what's interesting, at least to me, is the argument between Bukharin, who was already arguing in the middle of 1917 to junk the minimum program, wages, conditions, democratic demands, because he thought not only had Tsarism been overthrown, which was true, but he thought that the world stood on the cusp of socialist revolution. And it's interesting that in 1919, Lenin is saying, well, yeah, maybe, but we ought to keep the minimum program because we might be thrown back to capitalist rule. So yes, they did produce a new program in 1919, but still with the minimum section. The minimum section, as I said, deals with wages, conditions, but also democratic demands. The people's militia, the right to bear arms, unrestricted freedom of speech, etc., etc., etc. Okay. So that's the program of 1903. Now, I think it would be fair to say that this program could be described as a two-stage program. If you look at it, it says the main task that we have, this is, remember, written in 1903, the main task is to overthrow Tsarism. And on that basis, what we can have is a democracy, universal suffrage, a single assembly, progressive laws, but not socialism. It doesn't talk about nationalization, doesn't talk about going towards communism immediately after the overthrow of Tsarism. And certainly if you read Lenin, Plekhanov, and just general Marxists at the time, what they were envisaging is the development of capitalism. I mean, there's no doubt about that. Capitalism would have to do its job, create a mass proletariat, turn the proletariat from being a tiny minority in society to the majority. You could look at different paths, perhaps, for peasant agriculture, cooperatives, the Prussian road, the American road. Either way, I think it would be fair to say that this was a two-stage program. First of all, you overthrow Tsarism. The assumption would be then that universal suffrage would see the majority of the population, peasants, voting for some sort of bourgeois party. And even if it wasn't a bourgeois party, it would be bourgeoisified as the economy developed along capitalist lines. The working class would wait in the wings, build its strength, and ready itself through class struggle for taking power in its own name as part of the general worldwide, but especially European struggle for socialism. Now, of course, we all know what happened. There was a revolution in 1905, and instead of, as some might have expected, the bourgeoisie, to repeat the example of the bourgeoisie in France in 1789 and all the rest of it, Marat, Robespierre, and other such figures, the bourgeoisie didn't produce anything of the sort. You saw some rhetoric, but actually the bourgeoisie recoiled from revolution, recoiled from the idea of overthrowing Tsarism. And increasingly its, how should you put it, its programs, its parties reconciled themselves to actually taking a reformist view of Tsarism. And actually, that was something that was anticipated by the Second Congress of the RSDLP in 1903. They described the liberals as basically, although they would cooperate with them, basically described them as reactionary. 1905 was the proof. And what's interesting about 1905 is that both wings of the party, I mean, this is a party in name, remember, in 1903, maybe a few thousand comrades scattered throughout Russia. The party and both its wings actually assume mass proportions. And what we're talking about is Petrograd and Moscow, but not just there. The Bund had already been substantial, but clearly couldn't become hugely mass simply because it limited itself to the Jewish population, which was very important when it came to the first generation of workers. And it should be pointed out, there were an awful lot of Jews in the Mensheviks and a lot of Jews amongst the Bolsheviks. So the Bund didn't exclusively organize the Jewish proletariat or the socialist intelligentsia who were Jewish. But in the course of 1905, what we have is Lenin actually thinking things through again, not radically, but nonetheless. I think that what you've got, I don't know a better term, I'm not sticking with it, but I would call it, he produced a supplement, an appendix to the 1903 program, and that went by the name of two tactics of social democracy in the democratic revolution. And the tactics he was talking about, of course, weren't, Lenin used the word in a different way to us. What he was talking about wasn't tactics, which, change day by day, week by week, sometimes hour by hour. He was actually talking about two strategies of social democracy in the democratic revolution. The democratic revolution is the revolution that's going to overthrow Tsarism and introduce these freedoms that I've already referred to. Now, the Mensheviks were definitely looking to the liberal bourgeoisie, and they talked about pushing the liberal bourgeoisie into a struggle with Tsarism. They recognized the possibility that the bourgeoisie weren't going to be particularly keen, and they actually put forward the idea that, okay, we carry out the revolution, we get rid of Tsarism, and the we there is the working class, acting in the cities. We get rid of Tsarism, but then, having carried out this revolution, we retire to the wings and we constitute ourselves. This is a phrase from Karl Marx. We constitute ourselves a party of extreme opposition. We don't participate in any anti-Tsarist government. We don't participate in a government alongside the bourgeoisie. From Lenin's point of view, that's fine. I don't want to participate in a government with the counter-revolutionary bourgeoisie. But what about the peasantry? What about the peasantry? What about the working class leading the peasantry? And what about the working class not only overthrowing Tsarism, but having overthrown Tsarism, constituting itself part of a coalition that Lenin described as, what was it, the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry. Well, the revolutionary is quite straightforward. The democratic is quite straightforward. Dictatorship, this word is starting to move a little bit. I think we can say that what Lenin meant by it at the time would be the decisive rule of the majority. And that is the proletariat and peasantry. Now, Lenin was very open-ended about who would have a majority. This would be a provisional government. And what he was banking on wasn't so much the peasantry simply following the proletariat, which was a minority in Russia, but if this revolution could spark off Europe, then the proletariat would be in a hugely strong position. And this was sort of Lenin's position in 1905, in the summer of 1905. His pamphlet, Two Tactics, was printed in the many thousands. It would have become, how should I put it, I don't know about the Bolshevik Bible, but something along those lines. It's what constituted Bolshevism when it came to strategy. If we look at earlier Bolshevism that emerged out of the Second Congress, that was very much more concerned with organizational forms and whether you compromise with economism or whether you compromise with the Bund. Lenin at the time, 1903, one step forward, two steps back, and all the rest of it, said, well, this has got the seeds of a deeper opportunism. He's referring to the Mensheviks, but really things come out in 1905, and the Bolsheviks, develop the program, or how should we put it, add color to it, extend it, fill in empty spaces. Okay. I'm then going to jump straight over to the war, and I suppose we could just say that most of the Mensheviks adopted what they would have called revolutionary defensism. Some took an internationalist position, but what I would stress in terms of revolutionary defensism was the idea, this is what they were expressing, we're talking about before the overthrow of Tsarism, what they were saying verbally was that we're going to overthrow Tsarism, and that will be the best way to defeat Germany, or actually to defeat Germany's invasion of Russia. Russia, lost loads of territory, and that's what they were saying. Now, the Bolsheviks, Lenin, he had his position in Switzerland of revolutionary defeatism. That separated him from the centrists, that's Trotsky. And he said, look, it would be better if Russia got defeated than its victory. And we revolutionaries, are not going to be held back by questions of defense of Russia in terms of our aim of overthrowing Tsarism. Now, we know Tsarism collapsed February, March 1917. Initially, you had a provisional government that consisted of Duma deputies, cadets, and the like. You did have them being joined by one socialist, Kerensky. But as 1917 went on, more and more, bourgeois ministers went, more and more socialist ministers came in, and what we had the Bolsheviks charging them with is actually what you are. You're tied to the imperialist aims of Tsarism. You're locked in to the imperialist alliance with Anglo-French imperialism. And although they didn't have the evidence, we know it now, they very much suspected that the war aims of Russia included seizing Constantinople. I think it was still called Constantinople in those days, Istanbul, and the Bosphorus, and giving them access, giving Russia access to the Mediterranean. And so you had the Bolshevik agitators, Bolshevik leaders demanding the publication of the secret treaties. People knew that there were treaties, and basically saying that actually the Menshevik right and the socialist revolutionary rights were to all intents and purposes imperialist politicians and in the pocket of Anglo-French imperialism. Now, we've got the, I don't know, the story. I was brought up with it. It's a very widespread story, not just, one particular strand of thought on the left, but the story we've got, that comes to us is that Lenin's in Switzerland. We all know about the sealed train coming back with Zinoviev, arriving at the Finland station in Petrograd, being greeted as a hero. There's the socialist ministers with their flowers. Lenin basically saying, using an Anglo-Saxon, "fuck off." And Lenin then turning on the Bolshevik leaders in Petrograd, in particular Stalin and Kamenev, who'd come back earlier than Lenin from their exile in Siberia. They take over the editing of Pravda, and we have editorials in particular by Kamenev that come out with things like, "We will support the provisional government if they do X, Y, and Z." So if they go for a democratic peace, if they distribute land to the peasantry, if they institute elections to the constituent assembly. Now, the story we have is that Lenin was furious with this, and it could have been true that Lenin was furious with it. But we also have the idea that what Lenin did, he talks about old Bolshevism and it's useless now, and we've got to begin anew and all of that sort of stuff. And he also has the idea, remember, he's proposing it. Let's junk this name, RSDLP. Marx described social democracy as a pig of a name. I think Lenin was aware of that. But Bolshevik? What the hell is Bolshevik? Majorityist of a faction, of a party that has disgraced itself in the war? We don't want to be associated with the Mensheviks. Either way, we have this idea that Lenin comes back, and what he does supposedly is adopts Trotsky's permanent revolution. And I just think that's just plain false myself. We're not talking about permanent revolution, the pamphlet. We're talking about the pamphlet that's often published alongside that particular work. We're talking about Results and Prospects, which, unless I'm mistaken, I think was produced in 1906. And that is associated with the term permanent revolution. But also, if you look back at Lenin, summer of 1905, this pamphlet I've already referred to, the Bolshevik supplement to the program, what Lenin comes out with, and I'm not reading it in Russian, I'm reading it in English. And in English, permanent revolution of Trotsky is translated permanent revolution. And in Lenin's two tactics, what we get is uninterrupted revolution. Now, it's interesting. I don't know if you can see behind me, I've got Hal Draper's volumes. He actually says, well, if you want to get the idea over, uninterrupted revolution is a better description of both programs, because what we're talking about isn't something like I don't know, the rebel without a cause, James Dean, you know, whatever you've got, I'm a rebel against it. I want to carry out revolution until endlessly. That's just my personality. No, what we're talking about actually with Trotsky and actually with Lenin is we will carry out this revolution uninterruptedly until we arrive at working class power. Now, this is an idea that had been originally come up with, not the term permanent revolution, but this idea of uninterrupted revolution and the working class coming to power was originally thought up by Marx, 1848, 1849, 1851, that sort of period. Now, when I look at two tactics, and when I look at the Bolshevik program for 1917, of course, we're no longer talking about the overthrow of Tsarism. What we're talking about, though, is slogans which change, but still nonetheless to illustrate it, it's worthwhile. All power to the Soviets. All power to what Soviets? Not just the workers' Soviets, because in the cities, because of the war, you've also got soldiers' Soviets. Now, some of the soldiers come from an urban background. Some of the sailors come from an urban background, but the vast majority of soldiers come from a rural background. And you not only see soldiers Soviets, you also see the springing up of peasant Soviets. So what is the Bolshevik slogan? All power to the Soviets. To me, it's the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, concretized in conditions that no one had expected of dual power, because you had a provisional government, the Tsar had been overthrown, but also the peculiarity of 1917 until October/November was the leaders of the Soviet, not least leaders of the workers' Soviets, the Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries had some support in the workers' Soviets. These people were keeping in power the provisional government, but crucially carrying out the policy of the bourgeoisie, of imperialism. That was a peculiar situation. And basically what Lenin put forward in the April thesis was quite correct. We have to win the majority. And yeah, he had an argument with Kamenev. If you want to read the best account of that, I do recommend Lars T. Lee. You can find that on John Riddell's website, but also in the Weekly Worker. We had a sort of division of labor with Lars. We've not only put it up electronically, we've also printed Lars's comments. Either way, his argument was that the Bolsheviks didn't have to go through some, I don't know, born again experience with Lenin coming back from Switzerland. They were readily equipped. Yeah, there had to be adjustment throughout 1917, but interestingly, if you look at Lenin, he's very quickly back together with Kamenev as one of his major lieutenants. And what you see in terms of them is a joint argument against comrades in the Bolshevik Party on the left, who attempted to overthrow the provisional government, which they could have done. But Lenin says, Kamenev says, wait for the peasantry. We need a majority in the Soviets. Anyway, I'm going to come to an end. Suffice to say, if we look at the first Soviet government, what we see is not only Bolshevik commissars, Bolshevik ministers, we see them being joined by the left socialist revolutionaries, a coalition government, the socialist revolutionaries, have their main base amongst the peasantry. According to what I've read, I mean, I've got no strong opinion on it. It could well be right. Trotsky persuades Lenin to wait for the Congress of Soviets. And what we have is not only, as they all knew, a solid Bolshevik majority in the workers and soldiers Soviets. What you have is a left R majority in the peasants. These people were in favor of the overthrow of the provisional government, were in favor of a democratic peace, cancelling the imperialist secret treaties. They were in favor of the distribution of the land to the peasantry and not prevaricating. So you had, in my view, the fulfillment of the Bolshevik program. What happens afterwards is an entirely different question, because, yeah, we have stirrings in Germany, stirrings in Austria, but we don't have proletarian revolution. The proletariat is defeated, Russia is isolated, but that's not my subject for today. So yeah, the Bolshevik program, I think, was vindicated. But again, I would just say that when I do have discussions with Lars, I fundamentally disagree with him on this one. He thinks that the Bolshevik strategy of sparking the European Revolution, crucially, as the first decisive point, the German Revolution, was delusional. I fundamentally disagree with that. I think you could have had a revolution in Germany, but as I say, that's a subject for another opening by someone more expert than I am on the German revolution and the forces involved. So I'm going to finish with that. Tina, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jack. Really interesting introduction.
Much longer than I thought. Half an hour.
You can, if you have something else you want to cover, feel free. I'm sure there's going to be comments and questions from the floor. Comrades, if you would like to ask a question or whatever, or might comment or disagree, we love disagreements, as you know. Please click raise hand and we'll bring you in. There is I know why you explained the question of uninterrupted revolution. That obviously is often labeled or put against Lenin from the Trotskyists, comrades, and there are some in this meeting. Perhaps they want to make that case themselves. But why do you think there was so much emphasis on that question? That it's not Lenin didn't say permanent, Trotsky did it, and why does it matter? And understand Trotsky himself also made the point. He afterwards, after Lenin's death in particular, was trying to say Lenin actually agreed with me. He didn't get it at the time. He became a Trotskyist to all intents and purposes. What was the political situation, the reasons for that, if you could explain that while comrades still thinking about their questions and comments?
I mean, my own knowledge on this is too limited. And I mean, if someone here knows Russian, that would be helpful. But again, all I can say is that Draper, and I think that's right, simply says that in English, the word uninterrupted conveys what it's about better than the word permanent. Permanent means, in my English, without end. Uninterrupted means we go, uninterrupted journey. We get to where we want to go to. I mean, that's how I take it. Now, I have read Lenin, I think it's at the London Congress of the Bolsheviks, or it would be the RSDLP. This is when he's in alliance with Rosa Luxemburg. And Rosa Luxemburg comes up to him in the Congress and says something like, this is me being a bit cheeky, look here, Vladimir, is this uninterrupted revolution? Is this permanent revolution? And Lenin turns around and said, well, of course it is. And you can read that in Lenin, I think 1906, 1907, or that sort of period. So again, I don't know what exactly it conveys in Russian, but Lenin's response, and again, you can read that in Lenin, was, of course, can't you recognize that this is permanent revolution? And of course, he's referring not to Trotsky, but Marx. And the word permanent revolution, of course, goes back before Marx. And this is something, if you want to find about, all about it, read your Hal Draper. So yeah, I do think with Trotsky and the lessons of October, what we have, I think myself, is a rather desperate attempt to blacken the history of Bolshevism, to basically say that Bolshevism pre-1917 was irrelevant, because that's what Trotsky was not quite saying irrelevant, but basically he was dismissing both main wings of the RSDLP as, how should I put it, primitive or as inadequate. And he thought that spontaneity, the revolution itself, would sort things out and would unite the party, where Lenin was much more of the view, I'm prepared to unite with some Mensheviks, like, for example, the pro-party Mensheviks of Plekhanov for a time, but I'm not going to unite with what he called the liquidationist Mensheviks. These people should be expelled. I've expelled my liquidationists, he would say. You need to expel yours. Either way, I would say that if you look at, and I think I'm right, if you look at Trotsky's permanent revolution, he makes the argument, and I'm not someone who's done the scholarship, but he argues Lenin never actually read my work, i.e. Results and Prospects. He said that because he gets it wrong, and he's not arguing with me. I didn't call for not a czarist government, but a workers' government. That was Parvus. Lenin clearly was not arguing with me. He thought he was arguing with me, but he wasn't. And I'm prepared to accept that. And so what you get is a factional war between these two individuals. Lenin is the leader of a big, important faction. Trotsky is a nothing except he's brilliant. He's a brilliant, annoying, pain in the ass writer, right? Who really must have niggled Lenin. And he goes around organizing, I don't know, sideshows and buggering up Lenin's plans. That's how Lenin, I would suspect, viewed him until they eventually unite. And even that was a difficult thing. I think Trotsky, for example, said, I know he said, I've read the minutes, Zinoviev, Kamenev and Lenin visit the inter-district meeting that Trotsky joins when he comes back from exile. And Trotsky says, you've got to change the name. I hate the name Bolshevik. I've argued against Bolshevism all my political life. I'm not going to start calling myself a Bolshevik. And just reading my old friend Lars comments, well, actually, I think Lenin would have liked to have junked the name. The problem was that the masses knew the Bolsheviks as the Bolsheviks, and to have junked the name then and call themselves communists would have just caused confusion. The Bolsheviks were loved by the advanced section of the working class. That was their party. And as 1917 went on, they won the majority. So I suppose that the word majority stopped being associated with this obscure fight in London of 1903 and became known, I'm only guessing, but became known, these are the majority in the workers' Soviets. Either way, I don't think that there was a particularly useful polemic between Trotsky and Lenin then, except to add, if you read an associated pamphlet alongside Results and Prospects, Trotsky talks about a civil war. If we take power, there will be a civil war against between the workers and the peasants, and we will lose unless there's a European revolution. Lenin says, well, there might be, but we can actually maintain an alliance with the peasantry and the workers. But I can't really, you really have to ask someone along like Lars T. Lee, I think, to get a better insight into that question. I don't think there's much of substance there. That's my opinion.
Thank you. In terms of the development of the Bolsheviks program, that's what you described. You described not as a break, but as a development. Of course, if the top of your program is down with the Tsar, and the Tsar's down, then you have to amend your program and be flexible, and think of other more pertinent demands, etc. So there's a certain flexibility there of the Bolsheviks that we can view in this period. Could you describe a bit more, perhaps, how the changing situation, that we don't produce something that's in black and white and is forever valid, but that we have to understand how things are changing, how the Soviets are dominated by sort of the right, not the most radical forces, how that influences our program. And then also length of program would be an interesting one to look at, because we're having discussions now. We've had discussions in the communist fusion process. We're going to have discussions in the Corbyn party that's about to be launched, we hear, and that's going to be short and snappy. And there's something to be said for having slogans, isn't it? I mean, peace, land, and bread went down very well with the people in Russia. But of course, there was more to it, wasn't it? It wasn't just peace, land, and bread. It was a full program that explained to the working class what the Bolsheviks, the communists, try to achieve. So if you could say a couple of things on that. And comrades, we haven't got anybody with their hands up, so if anybody would like to ask some questions or make some comments or disagree, please do. Thanks, Jack.
Yeah, a couple of things. I just noticed my friend Alan Gibson in chat. I normally can't see, that's why I've been doing that, to put my glasses on. But Alan, I don't know whether he was being facetious. Oh, Trotsky, yeah, chair of the Petrograd Soviet, he said. Well, yeah, and it's interesting that if you read Trotsky, what you've got is a whole series of, instances of cooperation between the Bolsheviks and Trotsky at that time. That's absolutely right. So I don't want to convey the idea that Lenin's view of Trotsky was he was just a literati. No, in 1905, he took a leading position. He was arrested, sent to prison. Nonetheless, if we look at Trotsky's own words, he said, well, in terms of the party, Lenin did all the real work. I mean, okay, we don't want to turn it into one individual. But what did Trotsky's contribution consist of, towards the party? Nothing serious. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Yeah, okay, good point. Land, bread, and peace. We have had arguments, I remember, with George Galloway and Respect. There's an organization, because you just think of the word respect, and that's, hey, and if you say that one of them stands, I don't know, what did it stand for, socialism, and one of it stands for something else, that's basically all you need. What's interesting, this isn't the program, by the way, the program's in this book, that's why the minutes of the Congress, that's why I'm sort of referring to. What's interesting on that score is that the RSDLP program, for example, on agriculture, i.e. land, is incredibly detailed. I mean, this is something that Lenin specifically studied and is still actually quoted by bourgeois academics because he was so good. This is when he was in exile in Siberia, when he wrote that big fat book, The Development of Capitalism in Russia. There's all sorts of details about what to you and me is like, what the hell is that? Cut-off land. This is about, what the landlords keep and what they've charged the peasantry. They come out with a detailed plan. So it's not just some vagary. They are specific demands. When it comes to hours, there are specific demands. When it comes to rights, for women, We're dealing with specific demands. So yeah, the Marxist programs historically, if we look at the 19th century, have been incredibly short. But this is in a situation where, you know, there's us Marxists, and then there's the anarchists, or there's the Proudhonists. You could declare for a working class party no other trend, I think, apart from the Lassalleans would have come out with something like that. So brevity, of course, is a great strength, but worth noting that compared with the programs of European social democracy, the program of the RSDLP 1903 is much longer. The program of the Russian Communist Party 1919 is much longer, more approaching our length. Why? Because they wanted to deal with the Trotskysts. They wanted to deal with the existence of Soviets. They wanted to deal with the specific policy when it came to the peasantry, etc., etc., etc. Now, in terms of program, it's a broad brush, and you know, you can see the Bolsheviks in the summer of 1917 moving to redraft it. And I've already referred to Bukharin. He says, junk the minimum program. Lenin says, oh, you must be kidding. We're not even in power yet. Nonetheless, what you've got is they wanted, or at least Lenin wanted, to incorporate Soviets into the program. Well, within a few months, Soviets are in power. They don't amend the program until 1919. So no, programs shouldn't be viewed as the 10 Commandments. They're there as a guide. They're there basically, look, if you're a party member, read that. Do you understand it? Then you're a party member. If you fundamentally disagree with it, then there's a problem. So no, they're not religious texts. So I think I've answered. I don't know if there was anything else, Tina, that you asked, but
the kind of bit you talked about this is you saw it as a development of the program rather than a break. We had a bit in the chat. Somebody called you a Stalinist for not seriously discussing Trotsky's role in the 1917 revolution. I don't think that's the definition of Stalinism, but that may be as it is. But could you maybe explain your view on?
Well, I don't mind. I mean, clearly, anyone who looks at 1917 after Trotsky joins the Bolsheviks can't deny the contribution that Trotsky played. If you look at the Congress of the Bolsheviks when they elect their leadership, I think I'm not mistaken. I think Lenin gets a near unanimous vote. I think one person doesn't vote for him. That could easily be Lenin. I don't know what the culture was in the organization. And then what you get is Trotsky's within a few votes, Zinoviev and Kamenev. Clearly, there's a recognition amongst the Bolsheviks that Trotsky is a leading comrade. Trotsky becomes the leader of the Revolutionary Military Committee of the Petrograd Soviet, becomes the effective organizer of the October Revolution, and of course goes on to become the real architect of the Red Army. No one can take away that, and I'm not trying to take away that. If, on the other hand, you want to talk about Stalinism, Stalinism and Trotskyism, bizarrely, has the same April myth. Now, either that's because it's true, or because they share the same myth of Lenin coming along and the Bolsheviks all stupid, a bit like Jesus and his disciples. What's all this? I've never heard of this before. Well, yeah, you have since 1905. It just doesn't make sense to me. So the Stalinists have this view that, yeah, the Bolshevik rank and file were stupid. And what you have this great leader, Lenin, of course, then with the great leader, Stalin, he reveals the truth. They all go, yeah, we see it now, Vladimir. Yeah, and also what you get with the Stalinists is that what Lenin called for in October was a socialist revolution, which he actually denies in the April thesis and denies consistently thereafter. He does talk about now we should construct the socialist order, but what he meant by that, in my opinion, is we will spark the European revolution, and then we can get into what we mean by socialism stuff. But no, I'm not trying to denigrate Trotsky. I'm just trying to tell the truth. And I've learned a great deal from Trotsky. I admire his writings. I think, tell me anyone who's, not read, or who has read, excuse me, who's read, for example, his history of the Russian Revolution. And okay, we can criticize some aspects of it historically, but as a writer, my God, and you can see why, factionally, he was such an opponent for Lenin. And that's really what I was trying to get over. It wasn't because he was like the Mensheviks, who commanded serious forces, who had deep implantation in the working class, in the Soviets, both of 1905 and 1917. No, Trotsky was just one of these annoying people who happened to be a genius. And if they're on our side, i.e. on the side of the Bolsheviks, great. But if they're against you, he was an important opponent. And he couldn't be, although Lenin talked about him being a gadfly or something like that, he couldn't just swat him aside. Trotsky was an important figure, even in isolation. And so that's really what I'm trying to get over. But no, I don't buy into the myth that the Bolsheviks were stupid. I don't buy into the myth that it was just the great leader Lenin and Kamenev and Stalin and Zinoviev were all just waiting to become counter-revolutionaries or something like that. I just don't buy that. They were good Bolsheviks. So that's my version of the history.
Thank you.
Same Stalin, by the way, stayed true. I'm not arguing that, but 1917, that's my argument.
Thank you. There's a couple of comments on with your hand up, and we've also got a question, which I'll read out first. Could you elaborate on the 1917 slogans regarding the peasantry? Was this a sign of opportunism or flexibility, or perhaps the third part of the answer there is that, a recognition of the reality of Russia at the time?
Could I actually come in on that?
Yeah.
First, because otherwise I'll forget. Yes, you could argue that the Bolsheviks and Lenin were opportunists. That would certainly be an argument. And you could argue that they created the problems that we saw in the 20s, because what they did, I think, with brilliant tactical flair and flexibility, I don't think we can take that away from them, is that you had a commission established by the Provisional Revolutionary Government of, I think it was Chernov, if I'm not mistaken, that produced, was it 100 or something like that, recommendations of what to do about the land and the peasantry. And the provisional government didn't implement it. And so what Lenin did in the Soviets is say, okay, we will take the entire program of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, these 100 points. Forgive me if I've got the number wrong, comrades, but I think it was 100 points. Anyway, we'll take the whole of that program. We will implement it, but with one addition. This was Lenin's speech. All power to the Soviets. So we'll overthrow the provisional government, but we will implement this program. Now that meant the possibility, to use a Russian term, of the black distribution. Then instead of carrying out their program, the social democratic program, which will be collectivism, so collective farms, voluntary collective farms, what you have is the breakup of landlords' estates into little plots. And that is what happened. And therefore, the Bolsheviks, when they became the communists, were confronted with tiny, fragmented agriculture that was basically self-sufficient, that wasn't producing a surplus. So how do you feed the cities? They created this. To come to power, they needed to win the peasantry. Having come to power, God, what do we do to feed the cities? So yeah, if someone wanted to argue that this was opportunism, I could go, well, yeah, but my argument would be this, that nothing that the Bolsheviks did in terms of coming to power can be justified unless we put it into the context of world revolution and Europe. To have the idea we come to power in Russia, the working class will align itself with the, and we will rule and everything will be one. That's just bollocks, if you excuse the Anglo-Saxon. So, but I don't think Lenin had that idea. You could argue that he came round to that idea. If he did, and we could look at the text, he was wrong, but I don't think he did come round to that. So you can find famously in Stalin's Foundations of Leninism, 2 quotes of where Lenin says something along those lines. Okay, but then you've got the vast bulk of what Lenin says, and you just weigh it up and you go, well, and you can make the argument, and people have, that Trotsky came round to that view as well. So I just think that the whole lot of them were in isolation and therefore faced with the most horrible choices, and there wasn't any way out other than Europe. And okay, we can talk about the horrors of Stalin, but they were in a historical, how should I put it, pit, and they had no way out. And you look at Lenin's writings, and to me it's a desperate man coming out with desperate solutions which were never going to work, and nothing that Trotsky put forward other than the world revolution could possibly work, except as temporary measures. Okay, that's my answer on that. So.
Thank you. Ken, please.
Hello. Thank you very much for that, Jack. I was particularly interested in your comments on the dynamics of the relationship between Lenin and Trotsky. You made reference to the fact that when Lenin returned, he wasn't pleased with what Stalin had done, but beyond that, you hadn't said too much about Lenin's relationship, interaction with Stalin during this period. Now, that may be because there's simply not much evidence to substantiate that, but I'd still be interested to know if, at this early stage, what the dynamics between Lenin and Stalin were and how far that foreshadowed what was to come. Thank you.
Again, could I answer that rather than build up a... Yeah, I actually think, Ken, that I mean, Stalin was an important guy. So if you look at the Congress before Lenin arrived, he's delivering reports and stuff like that, but he's delivering it as number 2. It's Kamenev that's in charge, really. It's Kamenev that's coming out with the lead articles. Now, again, I think Lars has done a really good job on this question. So Lenin comes along and says, you shouldn't be offering any critical support whatsoever to the provisional government. He wants to draw these absolutely sharp, razor sharp lines, right? Now, again, we then come into personalities, we come into politics, and then you look at what actually happens. And I've already raised it, you know, publish the secret treaties. Democratic peace. So Lenin has sort of denounced Kamenev, but then he sort of, without saying it, he starts putting into practice, if I can coin the term, Kamenevism. Right? I mean, I think that's fair. Now we then get into October and the role of Kamenev and Zinoviev and their scabbery. That's a separate subject. But I would say myself that the relationship between Lenin and Trotsky, Lenin and Stalin was very much, he was a loyal follower. Sometimes he gets out of line. And the nature of the Bolsheviks was if you had an argument, they tended to be very fierce. And then when the argument was over, they tended to forget it. So, for example, over the national question and Stalin's plan, Lenin denounced him, remember, as a Russian chauvinist. You know, took a strip off him. But still, you still had him being trusted as being general secretary. So yeah, again, I think comrades asked Lenin, well, you fell out with Zinoviev and you denounced him as a scab. And Lenin said, well, yeah, but that was a long time ago and we've forgotten all that. We don't bother with that sort of stuff. And so he's a good comrade, and he's shown himself a good Bolshevik. So I think we need to understand the culture of the organization. This wasn't a soft culture. This was a culture that was used to very, very harsh language. Us in Britain today, we're real softies in comparison. Now, whether that's right or wrong, that's a different question, but that, I think, is the truth. So, yeah, I think the relationship was, how should I put it? He's a good lieutenant. I would also say, again, this is me maybe reading. My reading is that Lenin had his own circle that consisted of his wife, his sister, his brother, and he didn't go out drinking. He didn't go out socializing. Lenin, I don't know if he ever drank. And I think that if you take the RCP Central Committee, you also had a similar situation with Trotsky, that he wasn't an old Bolshevik. So if you take the old Bolsheviks, they'd known each other, they socialized, they intermarried. I know you had Trotsky's sister, wasn't he married? She married to Kamenev. Either way, the point I'm really trying to get over is we're dealing with personal dynamics. And I don't think that you could describe Lenin as a buddy of Trotsky. And I don't think you could describe Zinoviev or Kamenev as a buddy of Lenin. But I think you could describe, at least at that time, Kamenev and Zinoviev and Stalin as sort of buddies. These people socialized, they talked, they mixed. But anyway, I've done my best in terms of the relationship. But I would look myself less to Stalin and more at this time to Zinoviev and Kamenev. These were Lenin's closest, most trustworthy lieutenants, and that's why Lenin was furious later in the year, in the run-up to October, and was furious with Kamenev, not Stalin, in April 1917. He's dealing with people he trusts, who are closest to him politically, and hence his exasperation. Where if people were more distant, so I think that's at least my take on things.
Thank you.
Quickly then, I think it would make sense at this stage then, if I know you didn't want to speak about Stalinism and the rise of Stalin, but perhaps a quick, why and how, Stalinism turned into quite the hell for, mostly communists as well as it did. In your view, you've mentioned, the isolation of the Russian Revolution was, of course, a crucial aspect of it, and the backwardness of Russia. But perhaps you have a few other thoughts.
Very briefly, because it is a massive subject. Just to illustrate it, Stalinists hate this. I always point out to them, have you read Foundations of Leninism? And of course, they always reply, of course I have. And I say to them, have you read the first edition of Foundations of Leninism? Now, this is Stalin basically putting himself forward as the modest disciple of Lenin. I'm just a humble follower. I'm just, someone who's faithfully carrying out the words of Lenin. That was his pitch. I don't want to be leader or anything like that. I'm general secretary, I know, but that was a modest position. No, he puts forward, for example, to deliver the Politburo's meeting after Lenin's death. Who's going to deliver the report, the main report? I think the comrades say Trotsky. He goes, "Oh, that's dangerous. I don't want to put myself forward as the Bonaparte." Stalin, no. Zinoviev. Okay, so Zinoviev says, "Well, I'm up for that." Okay. The point I would make, if you take the first edition foundations of Leninism, he asked the question, this is Stalin style, can there be socialism in one country? No, of course not. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but no, of course not. What a ridiculous idea. Second edition, which comes out in the same year, well, of course there can. And there are two quotes from Lenin. Now, in my view, this document or this book, pamphlet, is of symbolic importance, of huge symbolic importance, because what he's doing, he's splitting the fate of the Russian Revolution from the world revolution, right? That's symbolic. And that matters, I think, in terms of later developments. And he puts forward the idea, along with Bukharin, that, okay, they can't get to what they might have called full socialism, or I might call full communism, or something along those lines. Doesn't really matter. But they're putting forward the idea that there's really a bright future for Russia in isolation. And I know Trotsky comes along with a similar, plan, along with Preobrazhensky. Yeah, you want to hang on. Of course, I understand. But the idea that you can uninterruptedly within Russia go towards such a future, I think is delusional. And I do think that, okay, if you're in a desperate situation, what do you want to do? I mean, I've had the argument, comrades have asked me, well, why didn't the Russian Bolsheviks just admit that they'd cocked up, they're isolated, and bugger off to Europe? Well, you could do, a few thousand of you. What about what then happens to the population of Petrograd, the population of Moscow? If you'd seen what happened in Finland, remember, part of the Russian Empire, which also had a red revolution, they also had a white counter-revolution. And I think the statistic is something like 10% of the proletariat in Finland were massacred. Now, that is what you would have expect in Petrograd. That's what you'd expect in Moscow. The forces of counter-revolution wouldn't have been satisfied with a few leaders who might have been able to get abroad. They would have massacred, as they did in cities, towns, and villages that they took over. They killed all Jews. That was just automatic. Kill the Yids and then kill the communists. And they would kill every single communist in every single village that they took over. So I just think that there was no civilized route where to retreat. And I don't want to, I mean, of course, I will morally attack and I will scientifically attack what happened in the Soviet Union under Stalin, yes. But I'm not going to set myself up and say, well, in 1918, 1919, 1920, if only you did this, if only you did that. And I know so much better because of, I've got the advantage of hindsight. I think that if the German Revolution didn't happen, they were lost. And it's a bit like looking at the Paris Commune. Marx said, well, you've done it, and I didn't advise you to. But if you've done it, you need to go out to the peasantry. You need to go out to the rest of France. Well, they didn't. What happens? You're lost and you die. So, tens of thousands of communards were killed. Tens of thousands were exiled. I just think it's one of those horrible, horrible periods of history, which we're still paying for because we haven't critiqued what happened, not thoroughly critiqued it. Trotsky came along and said, oh, it was Stalin and we needed a political revolution and there's only a thin strata. I just don't think that works. It was property relations. It's abandonment of Marxism, in my humble opinion. So what can I say? Why Stalin? I think that was accident. He was general secretary, had a position about, but you had, Trotskyists talking about Trotsky should have carried out a military coup. Maybe it would be more civilized, but a military coup, what would he have done with Stalin? What would he have done with Zinoviev and locked them up in, the secret police? He'd have to. What would he do with the majority of Bolsheviks? He said, this is a military coup and we're going to fight you. What's he do? So he didn't do it. But lots of Trotskyists say he was tempted. Some say he wasn't. But okay, so you go for a military coup. You carry it. Would the army have gone with him? I'm very dubious, but okay, you carry out a military coup. you suppress the Communist Party or you transform it. I can't see how anything good would have come off that. You could argue, and I know Hillel Ticktin has, that you wouldn't have had the massacres of the 30s. I don't know. I don't know. I don't think any of us know. I don't put it down to the uniquely evil one individual. Stalin wanted to wipe out the Bolshevik Party because the Bolshevik Party had this memory of proletarian internationalism. And if you went for a military coup, they'd still have this memory of democracy, I think. So what do you do about that? So I don't think there are any easy answers, but what we need to be doing is not coming out with excuses, not coming out with trite remarks. We've got to really, in my view, take up the task of Marx and investigate Russia with the sort of, or Russia, Soviet Union, with the same sort of thoroughness that Marx began to examine capitalism. Of course, he didn't get anywhere near completion, but it does say something for us, 100 years after the event, that we've got so little in the way of any worthwhile theory about the Soviet Union. Very, very little.
Very good answer. Alan is asking in the chat, did you say that Trotsky was putting forward something like socialism in one country?
Yeah, there's a book. What's his name? I think Anne. I don't know if Anne's. Oh, Anne lives with you. Sorry. Yeah, I think her former tutor put forward that argument. It's not my argument, but you can make that argument. There's a lot of stuff, about, if you look at Preobrazhensky, for example, Trotsky's economist. I mean, why did he go over to Stalin with the launch of the 5-year plan? He said, well, this is our plan. It's not quite our plan, but this is what the left opposition has been arguing for. And I would say, well, there's more than a grain of truth there, Alan. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not arguing that, but you could legitimately argue that. And you also can legitimately argue that Preobrazhensky didn't make a fundamental break when he went over to Stalin. He paid the price. He was executed, but he along with Pleitikov, former left communist, played a leading role. Wasn't he the deputy, heavy industry minister or something along those lines? A key role. And maybe, well, again, Trotsky made the argument, didn't he, quite rightly, that Stalin stole our program. Okay, carried it out, not over 20 years, but in a few years. So the super industrializers were sort of like, what? Nonetheless, it was their sort of program, primitive, what they call primitive socialist accumulation. Wasn't Stalin's idea. That idea wasn't originally Preobrazhensky, but he developed it most rigorously. Stalin simply took it, stole it. So this is the program of the left opposition. So yeah, I'm not arguing that, Alan, but as I said, I think his name was White. I can't remember his first name, but yeah, I think he's also sympathetic to Trotsky, by the way. He's not a Stalinist.
Look it up, Alan. Come back and tell us about it, why you disagree. Rafal, please.
Hello. Thank you, Jack and Tina, for the interesting talk. Since we've already sort of drifted from the original topic to questions of post-1917 developments and Trotsky, on the question that was just raised regarding Trotsky's own socialism in one country, what I would say is that I don't think. I think that Trotsky, if you consider socialism in one country to exclusively be the sort of necessary adaptation of the Soviet regime to the conditions they found themselves in of counter-revolutionary encirclement and siege, then obviously Trotsky has his own theory, because everyone in the Bolshevik Party was trying to figure out a way to survive, how to draw out for another few years and await the international revolution. I think to some extent, at least until I'd say the mid-30s, even Stalin was still holding out for an international revolution. But I think that the difference is that while Trotsky and the super-industrializers, and obviously with Preobrazhensky, had a plan for, turning the peasantry into an internal colony and practicing primitive socialist accumulation in order to perpetuate to proletarianize the peasantry and perpetuate the Soviet state. I do think that there's a crucial difference there between that and socialism in one country, in that they nonetheless never admitted and aggressively argued that nonetheless without international revolution socialism would not be possible. So I think there's a critical element of socialism in one country that's missing from any formulation of Trotsky's. As to my main point, I'd just like to slightly push back a bit more than others already have on the question of Trotsky being this scribbler who happened to be a genius on the sidelines of the party. I think calling him a nobody is, I mean, I don't know if you'd stand by that. I think that's very unfair. I don't think Lenin would spend so much time polemicizing so aggressively with someone he considered a nobody. I understand that, saying that Trotsky had no contribution to the party. I just don't think that holds up just because he didn't belong to either of the main factions of the RSDLP. I don't think you can say that he had no contribution to the party and building the party. A man who makes no contributions to the party and is a nobody doesn't become the chairman of the Petrograd Soviet. I think Lenin in 1905 was the nobody who no one was paying attention to, and the eyes of the world were on Trotsky. The eyes of the international working class movement and of the Russian working class were on Trotsky. I think that's in large part why Lenin spent so much time polemicizing with Trotsky after 1905 so aggressively. And on that point, I'd like to point out just one instance where I think that there is a case to be made that Lenin, so to speak, came over to Trotsky's camp in 1917. I don't have the specific citation, but I believe it's from a series of exchanges in 1907, where, in the aftermath of 1905, Trotsky's published Results and Prospects. Lenin's published Two Tactics of Struggle, and Lenin is at this point still making the argument on the alliance between the workers and the peasants in alignment with the SRs and with the cadets, and arguing for unity between the workers and peasants and the peasantry in total, while Trotsky is making the argument that no, the peasantry has strata. There is a upper peasantry, a rich peasantry, a middle peasantry, and a poor peasantry, and that the workers can make an alliance with the poor peasantry, but not with the rich peasantry. And Lenin is denying this in these polemics. And I think that in 1917, we definitely see Lenin come over to that side of the argument. Lenin is then acknowledging that the peasantry is divided, and he, in fact, is arguing that we need to mobilize the poor peasantry against the rich peasantry and bring the middle peasantry over to the side of the workers. So I do think that that is a concession to the argument that Trotsky is making in 1907. As to the point, and as to the point of Trotsky's argument that an alliance between the workers and peasants will end in a civil war. Their class interests contradict each other. I mean, I think, as you yourself have said, with the NEP and the scissors crisis that it eventually caused, I think we see the consequences of the work and peasant alliance is ultimately civil war. Yes, it happened already under Stalinism, but I don't, in my view, the NEP ending in forced collectivization and the dizzy with success industrialization of the 30s, I think that was a civil war between the working class in Russia under degenerated leadership and the peasantry, which was crushed and disorganized, did not have a political expression that it could count on, and so was defeated. But I think that Trotsky's position was ultimately entirely correct, and I think that Lenin did come to realize this, but was originally incorrect and overly optimistic, and accused Trotsky of pessimism. And that's, of course, where the frequent future attacks on Trotsky for underestimating the peasantry and for pessimism that would doom the Russian Revolution come from. Anyway, I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Rafa.
Can I come back?
Sure.
Great. Okay, well, just on Stalin, this is in his defense, what you'll find in Foundations, okay, this is 1924, he asked the question, does this mean, i.e. you can have socialist development or development towards social, does that mean that we can get to full socialism in isolation without the advanced countries? No, of course not. So socialism in one country, it's a sort of, it's a phrase, and we don't want to take it as absolute, and as an absolute literalism. So I don't think there's any doubt that if you take, for example, Stalin after World War II, you can argue he's forced to Sovietize, to use a phrase, Eastern Europe. But, you know, if you read him, I think he wants to spread the system. He also wants to come to a deal with the imperialists. And if the imperialists don't come to a deal, he's even more keen on spreading the system. So we can get into the, I mean, it's like Brezhnev, you know, Angola and Mozambique, you know. So, but again, this is not really the subject of, I say tonight, we really have strayed a long way. Okay, that's my argument on that one. So these people weren't just narrow-minded, we've got to stay, they weren't isolationists, you know, that we can do everything in Russia or anything like that. Okay, well, of course, you know, in any description, we can all use words. And if you want to pluck on my, he's a nobody, well, that meant that Trotsky didn't exist then, or something like that. I mean, that should just be silly. And of course, I think I've sort of made my case that Trotsky wasn't a nobody, he was a somebody. Clearly, you know, in 1905, he was chair of the Petrograd Soviet. He was a somebody. My argument is that if you take him after that, and you take him all the way to 1917, when he joins the Bolshevik party, tell me, comrades, what was his contribution to the party? And I'd be interested, because I don't know it. Who did he recruit? What did he write? No, I mean, he was known for unprincipled unity mongering. So, you know, the August Bloc, for example, polemics that mainly targeted the Bolsheviks, because these were the people that were the biggest opponents of unity, right? Because the Mensheviks, they weren't the problem, it's the Bolsheviks that were the problem. So, you know, I think I actually, in my defense, I actually quoted Trotsky himself on this one. Go away and read Trotsky and what he says about himself. And Trotsky was no modesty, was he? So, yeah, I think Stalin made the point about Trotsky, which isn't an invalid point. He said that Trotsky is a man of the revolution. When the revolution is going forward, he towers like a giant. So 1917, 1905, but he isn't a man of the party. Now, you could argue about that after 1917, in the middle of 1917, but again, that's not really my subject. I am arguing that he's talented, extraordinarily talented. Why did Lenin polemicize with him? I don't think it's just a question of 1905. I think I think it's precisely that he was talented, but using his talent not to build the party, right? Clearly, he was using his talent mainly to attack the Bolsheviks. That's my argument. I don't know what the world was doing. If you take the Socialist International, clearly they recognized the Bolsheviks as a serious force. They recognized the Mensheviks as a serious force. So Lenin, for example, puts forward Plekhanov to be the representative of RSDLP, but he could put himself forward. Trotsky wasn't put forward. He would never have been put forward. Anyway, that's just that one. Okay, Raphael, look, I don't know. I'm not sure exactly where you're coming from, but I'll simply say this. I don't accept, the first 5-year plan, collectivization and all the rest of it. And what happened in the countryside is the workers versus the peasantry. In my view, this was as much directed against the working class as it was the peasantry. Indeed, my argument would be that if you actually, I mean, I can argue this scientifically, that if you actually take the surplus that was necessary for the first 5-year plan, it didn't come from the countryside because the countryside was turned into a chaos. It wasn't producing a surplus. The countryside was starving. The cities went hungry. There was mass, I don't know if you ever read Sholokov, Virgin Soil Upturned. This is a Stalinist writer. Read his description of the countryside. It's frightening. And that's someone who's for it. So no, I don't buy that. The working class was politically expropriated. The working class was turned into a slave class. The peasantry were re-enserfed. Okay, to use, maybe we need new words, but that's the words I'm going to stick for, is extraordinarily shorthand description. The working class was an exploited class. It was not the ruling class. Russia in the 1930s, Soviet Union in the 1930s, was not a workers' state. Right? It was a state against the workers, against the peasantry. Now, it was a peculiar state. What was the ruling class? Was it capitalist? Now, Ant is going to come in and tell us that it was capitalist. Except it didn't have money, didn't have capital accumulation, didn't have wage labor. What's a peculiar capitalism? As far as it wasn't capitalism, it was something else that needs to be understood. But it wasn't a workers' state. So okay, if you want to say Trotsky was right, okay, of course Trotsky warned of that. Okay, so Trotsky was right. If you want to say Trotsky's right, I don't mind. But the point I would say that Lenin's slogan was this, and this is in 1917, with the whole of the peasantry against the regime, and that was the Tsarist regime and the provisional government, the whole of the peasantry. That included mobilizing the kulaks. Of course, they talked about poor, but they got the kulaks to get their hands on this bit of land. That was the result of October and the black distribution that I referred to. So then the Bolsheviks said, after we've seized power, then we'll differentiate. And that was something you'll find in Two Tactics. So this isn't new for Lenin. This is nonsense. The real question is how successful they were at that. And by all the evidence, I don't think they really understood the peasantry, because these were urban guys, intellectuals. And I know Lenin studied the question in tremendous detail. But again, just to get it over, if you read Sholokov, who's dealing with the Cossacks, what he's dealing with is that the poor peasant isn't necessarily someone who says, oh, I hate the kulak, because the kulak could be his uncle. The kulak was both an exploiter, but he's also someone who lives next door to you. You might want to marry his daughter, or, these people were intermixed. It was complex. So yeah, they tried to do those politics, but by all accounts, it wasn't very successful. So again, this is theory and practice, but the key question to me, and this is the whole point about the original talk, is it's the European Revolution. And I think that this is what the Bolsheviks gambled on, where if you take the Mensheviks, they said, no, we can overthrow Tsarism, and we then can develop capitalism along the lines of Western Europe. Now, that was delusional as well, because Russia would never be allowed to join France or Belgium or Britain or Germany. It was always going to be a semi-colony, at least that would be the argument. So the Mensheviks, I think, were and the idea that the bourgeoisie was a democratic class and would introduce democracy. I mean, it's a very bad Marxoid or Marxist phrase, in my view, because the bourgeoisie never voluntarily introduced democracy. Go to work tomorrow morning and say to the boss, oh, let's have a vote on what we do. They'll sack you. So the bourgeoisie is not a democratic class, and yet you know, Marxists were putting forward the argument, oh, with that comes parliament, with that comes freedom of speech, with that become, you know, because they didn't look at the working class in Western Europe having won these things through bitter struggle. They saw it as a package that somehow goes with capitalism, and it doesn't go hand in hand with capitalism. I mean, it does because the working class grows, its political economy grows inside capitalism. The Bolsheviks, SRs and all the rest of it, certainly not with the cadets. The cadets were branded by the Bolsheviks as counter-revolutionary. Not as a, you can have temporary agreements with them, like smuggling stuff. You can come to an agreement in terms of Tsarist elections, sure, but not a strategic alliance, absolutely not. And it was the Mensheviks that wanted a strategic alliance with the bourgeoisie and therefore the cadets. And this was the argument in two tactics. That's why you get the name. The Mensheviks, the bourgeoisie, were going to be an ally that the proletariat should push, encourage. Don't go too far. You'll frighten the cadets. You'll frighten the bourgeoisie. Lenin's view was, again, I'm using Anglo-Saxon, fuck the bourgeoisie. They are counter-revolutionary. We will crush them. And we'll crush them in alliance with the peasantry. And we want to keep the peasantry split from these counter-revolutionaries. So the peasantry, he would say, well, it's got two souls. You can win it to the proletariat or they go to the bourgeoisie. We want them on our side. And that was the key to the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution was fundamentally a peasant revolution. Without the peasantry, nothing could be done. On the other hand, the proletariat was going to be severely limited unless it got Europe, and it didn't get Europe. So hence my argument. So yeah.
Thanks, Jack, for taking the time to answer Conrad in some detail. That's very useful. I'm going to bring Alan in first. Apologies, and because I know Alan is going to speak on this subject as well.
Yeah, just a couple of points there. I think that in terms of the question of strategy, it's also, I know I won't talk about that, right? So back what I was going to talk about, what I want to talk about is the question of Trotsky and, oh shit, sorry.
You want me to bring Ant in first? You want to gather?
Yeah. Sorry.
Okay. Ant, go on then.
Get down. Sorry, dog. Sorry.
Am I on? Yes.
Go on, Ant.
Okay. I suppose, I think Jack before was sort of like second guessing what I was going to say. So I'm going to try and give him the slip. As I said, I agree with a lot of what you said, Jack. I thought, a lot of good points. I think, specifically the lack of any sort of way out, given the failure of the wider European Revolution, the German Revolution in particular. But I'm going to perform as you expect. Actually, I'll admit it. Proletarian revolution is not like bourgeois revolution. The bourgeoisie can build its power within feudalism, and all it's got to do is place its representatives at the top, and it's basically that the job is done. I think Lenin wrote that the democratic republic is the ideal shell of capitalism, but the proletarian revolution is a different thing altogether. It cannot be done by representatives acting on behalf of the class. So, for example, let's talk a few figures. The Bolshevik Party in autumn of 1917, it did grow massively. I think it hit about 300,000 members. But you've got to think that in Petrograd alone, I think at that exact moment in time, there were 2 million people. That's one city. What I think is the issue that we're butting heads on all the time. Is the relationship between the party and the class and the necessity of class organs. I'll just quote you, simple, it's only 2 lines. Soviet Russia was the first nation in history to witness the birth across its land of thousands of communal organizations spontaneously engaged in collective life. But I think that the idea of the Soviets, not only the many communal experiments, but the actual Soviets, this was something relatively new, and I think to a certain extent, the Bolsheviks could be, I don't know, forgiven to a certain extent in not understanding the implications of these class-wide organs. But when you have not got these class-wide organs, when the Soviets died off, a lot, civil war, people leaving the cities because they were starving. When the Soviets became empty shells, when the Bolsheviks started, introducing a whole series of measures which led to a party state, then the revolution was over. Yes. I'm going to give you another quote from 1952, the platform of the Internationalist Communist Party. At no time and for no reason does the proletariat abandon its combative role. It does not delegate to others its historical mission. It does not give its power to anyone, not even its class party. There must be proletarian power, proletarian democracy, expressed through its own class-wide organs. Okay. I actually thought we were going to get a very, very different talk today. I thought you were going to talk about the brief successes of the 1917 revolution, and there were some incredibly inspiring actions. Not least of all for women. That's just mentioning one aspect of it. But you never really went into what was good about 1917, and there was plenty of good about 1917. But no, there's no getting around the fact that it could not be sustained simply within Russia. The conditions in Russia were akin to the Black Death. Yes. Basically, the working class to a large extent was simply wiped out. Definitely, the Soviets were reduced to empty shells. So there was no Soviet power. There was no power in the hands of proletarian organs. Beyond, I don't know, early 1920s. Yes, and the party state which replaced the Soviet power of 1917 was, in fact, the expression of a victorious counter-revolution. Okay, what was the essence of this Bolshevik program that you talk about? The title of this current episode, the Bolshevik program. I think it boils down to one line: all power to the Soviets. That was the essence of the Soviet program. They didn't have a worked out economic strategy. I quoted in the chat that only the working class could create socialism. Yes, only the masses themselves could create socialism. There was no economic plan, nor could there have been an economic plan. Yes, and then yeah, okay. I'm going to go. The last thing. As regards, the way the episode has actually developed, it's Trotsky versus Stalin, Stalin versus Trotsky. Trotsky was right, and Trotsky contributed little, or Trotsky was wonderful. But I'm going to say, for solutions, we have to look beyond Stalin or Trotskyism. They've got far more in common than what differentiates them. Trotsky could not accept that the counter-revolution had in fact occurred. He maintained that the Soviet Union, was something to defend. So right up to his death, World War II, defend Russia, and I'm going to say that made Trotsky a counter-revolutionary. Okay.
Just to
Thank you
clarify,
very-
I mean, we've had a session on the Russian Revolution a few weeks ago where we discussed those issues. Tonight was about the Bolsheviks and their program. That's why we didn't go over the whole revolution again. Jack, do you want me to bring Alan in first, or do you want to? Okay.
What time do we finish?
Well, 15 minutes, I think.
I think Alan should come in then, and then I can
Okay.
wrap things up if that's okay.
Yeah, well, I think sorry about that. Before we've got this new puppy, and she decided to piss on the floor. Then it kind of threw me off. Actually, picking up from what Anta's saying, the question of program is very important in the period of the Russian Revolution, and I think I agree with much of what Jack outlined in terms of the revolution was dependent on it spreading, particularly through Europe, and when it failed, people were writing about this. They were discussing it. What the fuck's going to happen? The Germans have fucked it up. The bloody anyway, and they want to sort out what will happen with the Soviet Union. And they all think that capitalism will come back. There'll be another white terror. But instead, this other thing happened. And in terms of, I mean, we can look back at all the decisions the Bolsheviks took, and we can look back with hindsight, which is going to infect how we think about it, because we know what things led to. But they were just doing their best. And then something happened, and something new was created. Now, I disagree entirely with Ant there. Well, not entirely. No, I don't. I think because I give more weight to the Soviets than perhaps the CPGB does. But Trotsky certainly wasn't a counter-revolutionary. But the question I think we agree on, those two positions, the one I hold is a slight variant in between them, is that there needed to be a revolution. So what was the program against this thing? Whatever you want to call it. Don't want to call it a worker state, don't call it that. Call it something else. I don't care what you call it. What's the program to deal with this thing, which is causing a huge amount of problems because of the politics that it spreads, which are effectively no internationalism and conciliation with not just compromise, but taking that to another stage, which finds fruition in the Popular Front, with capitalism, and particularly international imperialism, and the betrayals of revolutions that occur because of that, and the betrayals of pre-revolution situations, which we don't know so much about. But so we all agree there needs to be a revolution to get rid of that leadership and to put the working class into power, probably through some kind of Soviet-ish kind of thing. But what do we do when that thing, whatever it is, that power, the state power, it's because it's a real state power, it didn't move away at all, got more consolidated. What happens when that finds itself in a conflict with capitalist restorationists, either internal or external? And that's where this discussion has taken place and developed. That's, I think, the interesting question which was posed for, I imagine, most of the audience for a good chunk of their political lives before 1991, when that question was resolved. What do you do in relation to that? Do you take a military side? And I know you disagree with the idea of military and political. I don't know what Ant thinks about that. But do you take a side while still being for a revolution to overthrow that, the bureaucratic, whatever, class, caste, whatever, the thing that's running the show, as opposed to the working class running the show? So in terms of program and thinking about it in those terms, I think that's a key question if you're going to discuss at all how communists should respond to the that society. I call it a deformed worker state. Some people call it bureaucratic socialism. Some people call it state capitalism. But what do you do in relation to that if it finds itself in conflict with any kind of capitalism, but I guess specifically imperialism, which would be the force leading the attempts to overthrow whatever it was and to bring in capitalism. So I'm interested to know what Ant thinks about that, because I don't think I've heard you say that, but probably isn't time for that. I'll have to arrange that some other time, but I guess you can respond to that, Jack. And sorry if that was discussed at the previous session. But that, I think, is the important political question to talk about it, not so much about the internal stuff or even, finish. Sorry, going on about that.
Thanks, Alan. Yes, I suspect over to you now, Jack, to reply to both Alan and Ant and sum up. And perhaps we could, as a final thought, when you're summing up, also what we can actually learn from the Bolsheviks' attitude to program and their flexibility, etc. in that period, in 2 sentences.
Wow. Yeah, we've travelled far and wide, haven't we?
Yeah.
I'll do my damn best to come back to program at the end, because
That'd be great.
we're almost at the level now, I think, of speculating, is there communism on Alpha Centauri or something along those
Put
lines?
that in as well, please. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, look, the bourgeoisie. Well, the bourgeois revolution has taken different forms, and I would simply put in the English Revolution and the French Revolution. I don't know enough about the Dutch Revolution, so I'm not going to go there. But there was a mobilization of those below, and certainly in France, that occurred in no uncertain terms. And I think, and this is what I argued earlier on, this was the model that Marxists picked up. And this is the sort of attribute, the sort of features that they projected onto the bourgeoisie. So when the bourgeoisie didn't perform, I'm not saying it threw them. It threw them into something of a crisis. They had to think things through. And what I'm sort of pointing to is that Lenin in 1905, this is before Trotsky, remember, right? He's a leader of something that matters in Russia as a party. And he's coming up with this idea that not only the bourgeoisie counter-revolutionary, but we, the working class, can participate in not only overthrowing Tsarism, but a post-Tsarist regime. This was, I'm not saying, well, it had its elements of novelty. Anyway, I'm not going to go there, but that was the real point I'm making there. So I'm simply making the point about the bourgeoisie don't simply put people at the top. Yeah, this became the model. So in Germany, it was the Junkers, Bismarck, that carries out national unification. Anyway, so that's an aside. Okay. I don't accept this idea that Ant's putting forward, that the working class doesn't actually exercise. I think that's what he's arguing, doesn't exercise power through a party. I think that's what he's arguing. If he is, that's fundamentally mistaken, because if we take all of these Soviets, what gives them coherence, what gives them direction, what gives them possibility is Bolshevik leadership. So before Bolshevik leadership, you had Soviets. Yeah, sure. And what were they doing? Supporting the war effort of Russia and Anglo-French imperialism. What were they doing about the land? Nothing. Or having a commission of inquiry. Yeah. What were they doing about calling elections? Well, as little as damn possible. So Soviets by themselves, no. And I certainly don't think that you're right, that you would sum up the Bolshevik program by saying it was simply all power to Soviets. No, it's definitely not. The Bolshevik reaction in 1905 wrong or right, was to be, what the fuck is this? These are Menshevik institutions. What we want to do is build the party. It's the party that's crucial. It's true in 1917 that they end up with a majority, but you have in the middle of 1917 Lenin saying that the Soviets are dead because of the Menshevik right SR leadership, and he looks to things like shop stewards committees. So I don't agree that, you know, parties are I don't know, something alien to our class or whatever, or the working class doesn't rule through its party. It does rule. I can't see it ruling through anything else, actually, because the working class, if it's atomized, if the working class, if it's not led by a genuine principled working class party, is incapable of ruling, incapable of conducting a serious struggle. So myself, I think that the party is crucial. That's why democracy in the party, but principle and correctness when it comes to program is absolutely essential. These things are not spontaneously arrived at. They're arrived at through struggle. They're arrived at through the development of theory, investigation, debate, testing things out. Okay, I got at least some sympathy with what Ant was saying, and I'm going to be very careful here. There are similarities between what people call Stalinism, i.e. what I call official communism, and Trotskyism. I mean, I find it, or have found it, like, weird. When the Soviet Union collapsed, when it definitively proved itself to be a dead end, read the pamphlets that were produced by what became the Communist Party of Britain. And what it was Trotskyism. Now, of course, this is Trotskyism post 1991, with no attribution. We've nicked these ideas about bureaucracy and I don't know, going down the capitalist road, and or Tony Chater of the CPB were basically nicking Trotsky. And of course, it was absolutely without the critical content of Trotsky. When Trotsky was writing in the 30s, he was trying to critique. Now, I think his critique was wrong. He called it provisional. I think it's, sorry, I don't mean this rudely, but I think it's dumb to stick with the word of Trotsky. Use him to open a door, open a window, use him, you know, his critique of the first 5-year plan is worthwhile reading. He gets it wrong, but he also gets so much right. But to stop with that, to stick with that, I just think is un-Marxist. I don't think it does any favors to Trotsky's memory. I think the last thing that he would have wanted to establish is something equivalent to a church that simply repeats his words as, you know, tablets of stone or something along those lines. But I would agree with Alan that when Trotsky called for a political revolution, we can get into World War II and defending this and defending that, but that really is beyond this talk, I'm sorry. But when he's talking about a political revolution, I take it seriously. He wanted a revolution. Now, in my view, in my assessment, I don't think, I mean, I called for the same thing. I called for a political revolution all the way up to 1991, the overthrow of the official leadership, sweep it away. To me, that is revolution. The real problem is that in the Soviet Union, because it wasn't capitalism, at least not of the Western sort, you had an atomized, you had the workers weren't a class. They weren't organized, and they couldn't organize as a class. And therefore you can call for political revolution, you can call for social revolution. It had no possibility of turning into an actuality. Anyway, what I did after 1991, I thought, well, my ideas, they weren't bad, as a critique. It wasn't bad as a prediction. I predicted it would go capitalist. I didn't think that it would. I didn't think that was impossible. I thought it was all too likely. I know Ant would say, well, it was always capitalism. But anyway, I thought it would go capitalist. And I also thought that the human cost would be enormous and horrible. I mean, the crashing living standards, crashing life expectancy, the poverty, the drunkenness, the despair, and what we've paid for it in the West. So I can say, I told you so. But what I did, I went back to the drawing board. And I said, we've got to examine the Soviet Union. We've got to examine that history from the beginning and not rely on old formulas. That doesn't mean we dismiss old writings, but we need to begin and investigate it in a truly radical way. And so, yeah, I listened to what Alan said, and I thought what you were saying, Alan, is thoughtful. And I think that's exactly the right approach, that given the complexities and the unexpected nature of the world that we've been living through, we need to think, rethink, and think again. And so, yeah, I agree with what you're saying in that respect. And again, I agree that, of course, comrades like Trotsky, in my view, I call him comrade, no problem, were motivated by the interests of the global proletariat. I think Stalin was until you start to get him more being aligned to this social, whatever you want to call it. I'll call it a bureaucracy, and you get the bureaucracy turning from being a part of the working class to turning against the working class, turning the working class into a slave class. Said it before, the peasantry, turning them into class for exploitation, a serf class. So what I've tried to argue is, I think that the Bolshevik program, taking it in its broadest sense, was vindicated in 1917. And I've said all the time that this was predicated on the European Revolution. And so, okay, did they succeed in triggering the European Revolution? No. But that doesn't mean that I don't look back at that program and programmatic documents like Two Tactics, and not taking them as a model, but nonetheless, we do need program. Without program, we cannot have a serious party. We cannot have a serious strategy. So we need to take our program seriously. And I'm not going to get hung up on whether the program should be, 10,000 words or 30,000 words. I think 30,000 words, British Road to Socialism, is far too long. But if it has to be 30,000 words, okay, I can live with it. The key question is the program right or is it wrong? Is it useful or is it useless? Is it a series of platitudes or is it a guide to action? So I think that the Bolsheviks from 1903 had a useful program. I think from 1905, they had a brilliant program. Did it take them beyond 1917? No. Did it provide them with an economic blueprint? No. Should it have? No. Finished.
Very good summing up. Thank you very much, Jack. And thank you for your patience in answering all those questions and comments. A very useful session. Good, glad to hear it. And I know we've strayed a little bit off topic, but I think that's almost impossible to avoid once you start talking about the Russian Revolution and the Soviet Union. All these issues come up. So, we've had some comments there. It's the best session yet. There you go. Thank you very much, Jack. You're muted. Sorry. Thank you. Did you want to say something?
Just joking, Tina. It's the only one he's attended.
No, surely not. I'm sure our comrades have watched many, many sessions. Thank you very much, comrades, and we'll see you again next week. Thank you.